Welcome! I'm so glad you're here. We are going to build a DIY guitar pedal today. Now if you don't already have a Mass Effects Beginner's Pedal Kit, you can buy one at our shop. I'll put the link in the description. This kit is really special and I'm really excited to share this with you. We've worked very hard to make this kit as affordable as possible. It's one of the most affordable options on the market. And moreover, we've tried to take every possible stumbling block out of it so that your first pedal, or maybe it's not your first, maybe it's your second, third, or fifth, but today when you build this pedal, you will succeed. Over the years, I've watched as newcomers to the hobby build their first guitar pedals and stumble, and they fail, and they end up frustrated, they end up not having fun and not enjoying this hobby. So what I've done is I've tried to take every single possible stumbling point that I've seen people trip over and eliminate that with this kit. So the goal is today you are going to build a pedal, you're going to have success, and you're going to have fun. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's inside the kit. So in your kit, you're going to have some welcome cards and some swag and stuff. We can set all that stuff aside. We've got our Beginner's Pedal Kit guide booklet. We also have a PDF of this on the website if that's more your speed. We have a one-page poster sheet here. That's a good handy reference. Maybe you can just set it up on your table as you work. Maybe you can even work on top of it. You can see the schematic here, a quick little overview on how to solder, what some good and bad solder joints look like, and some other info. It's just a handy reference sheet. On the note about how to solder, now if you haven't yet gone through our how to solder guide, either the PDF booklet or the printed booklet or our video, it's really important you go ahead and do that now. One of the key points to succeed with this kit is you need to be able to solder. And it really doesn't take that long to learn. Hopefully you can learn in anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. Just a little bit of practice. And on that note, let's go ahead and open up our box even further. This kit comes with a soldering practice kit. So this practice kit will allow you to perfect your soldering before you go and try to do your pedal. It's much better that you make a mistake with this cheap little practice kit than to ruin your pedal. So go check out the how to solder guide. Build our practice soldering kit, and then come back. All right, so let's set these aside. We have a bag of parts. So this is various hardware for our pedal. It's the stuff that's pretty easy to identify. We've got our circuit board. Yours may or may not be wrapped in plastic. We have our pre-sorted components. So this little cardboard tray has the components that are easy to get mixed up. So we've pre-sorted those for you. You've got your fun little DIY merit badge for when you're done, a pick, some other swag. We'll set that aside. And finally, we've got our enclosure. Your enclosure may already be printed and powder coated like this one. This one's powder coated gray and has a printing of a fuzzy sweater. This is one of my favorites. I love this fuzzy sweater design. But yours may be printed, it may be plain aluminum, it's up to you. When you purchase this kit, you choose which one you like to use. Inside your enclosure, you probably have some screws to hold the back plate on. So I'm gonna set this back plate and the screws aside. We won't need those for a while. We'll set this enclosure off to the side as well. And let's start going through our parts here. So I'm gonna open up this bag. And we've got a variety of stuff here. We've got some potentiometers, some knobs, we've got our foot switch, we've got a couple of audio jacks, we've got our power DC jack, a bunch of nuts and washers, a couple of ribbon cables, an LED holder, and this handy dandy little tool. Now, this pile of parts is probably sort of overwhelming, but don't worry. If you go into our little booklet here, we've got a page that shows you every single part, what it is. It helps you identify the different nuts and washers. Here's an overview of our pre-sorted components. These are the ones that come in our pre-sorted component tray. And this tool here is kind of neat. It's basically 3 wrenches in one. We've got a wrench for our in and out jacks, a wrench for our potentiometers, they're called pots here, and a wrench for our foot switch. Now, if you have a wrench or a socket, you could use those later on and that's fine. But if you don't have those tools, I don't want you to go out and buy a $30 or $60 socket set just to put together one pedal. That's silly. So that's why we're going to include this little tool here. And on that note, we've made some other choices in this kit that are going to help you build it with minimal tooling. In fact, all you really need is your soldering iron, some solder, and your flush cutters. And then, of course, this little tool that we've provided. There's other tools that can help you along the way, but they're not strictly necessary. You know, we want you to be able to get into this hobby without having to invest in a large toolbox. So hopefully that helps. Now, regarding the pre-sorted components, let's go ahead and open this up. This little sticker here is perforated, so you should be able to just cut it open with your nail. So let's pull that open, and you see here we've got R1, and R is for resistor, R2, R3, D1, D for diode, D2, C1, C for capacitor, C2, and Q1. Q is for transistor. And we've got our circuit board. So our circuit board is actually 3 circuit boards in one. We have a circuit board here for our jacks, we've got our main circuit board for our audio circuit, and we've got a circuit board down here for our foot switch and the LED. Now, I'm going to show you a little trick here. As we go through this video, I'm going to go through the booklet, and I'm going to use this booklet as my guide for step by step. And, you know, if you want, there's a lot to read in this booklet. It'll explain to you exactly how to do each step. It'll also have little asides here and there that give you some extra info, you know, just sort of sidebars in case you want to learn more. But if you're not the type of person who wants to read this in detail, here's the trick. The trick is just follow along with the pictures, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So I can build this whole pedal just by going page to page, glance at the picture and see what it says, and that's my step. So if I jump here to page 11, my first step is to snap these circuit boards apart. So let's do that. And you can see these circuit boards have these little perforations. So what I want to do is I want to break it on those perforations. I don't want to cut it, I want to break it. So if you try to cut it, you might end up snapping the blade of your cutters. So in order to break that, what I'm going to do is just grab it with my hands and snap it. Grab this part with my hands, snap it. And that's it. Now, we're left with these little perforated remaining pieces on there. And what I want to do to get rid of those is use my flush cutters or your wire cutters or whatever you have. And I am not going to cut that off. I'm just using this and I'm gripping it right on that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn. I'm going to snap it off. So here we go. Let's snap, and it came right off. Now I have another one right here. I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to turn and snap it right off. Okay, with our circuit boards broken apart, we refer back to our booklet, and we see our next step is to start building the main PCB, or printed circuit board. So the first thing we're going to do is put D1 onto the circuit board. So I'm going to set these other 2 circuit boards aside, and we're going to focus on this one right here. So my iron is heating up right now. I'm going to go to my pre-sorted component tray and I'm going to find D1. So D1 is right here. And it's already sort of sticking up, so I'm going to just grab it. If you're having trouble grabbing at it, just poke at it with something, use your flush cutters or something to push it through to get that component out. In order to put D1 into the circuit board, I'm going to first bend its legs, just like we did with our soldering practice kit and our resistors. Now, I'm going to look closely at the circuit board and you will see there is a stripe on one side of the D1. Let me see if I can get a better view of this. And if you look at our diode, you'll see there's a black stripe on one side of it. So let me flip this over and you can see the black stripe on the left side here can correspond to the stripe on the circuit board right there. So I'm going to put that in following that direction. And the direction matters because the current will only flow effectively in one direction. So push that through. I'm going to use my needle nose pliers to get it nice and flush. If you don't have these, that's fine though. You can use your fingers to pull it through. It's just a little trickier. All right, so that's sitting in there now. The black stripe is over the stripe on the circuit board. I'm good to go. I'm going to go ahead and flip this over, use my putty to hold the circuit board in place, and let's go ahead and solder this first joint. So my soldering iron's been sitting here. It's time to clean the tip, so I'm going to wipe it really well. And put a little bit of solder on there to get a good wet flow of molten solder on that. And now come back over to my circuit board. And what I'm going to do is just like we did in our practice how to solder guide or our practice kit, I'm going to first create a little heat bridge. So I'm going to put a bit of melted solder between the soldering iron's tip and the pad and the component, and that's going to allow the heat to flow into the pad and the component. Then I'm going to come at it from the other side with my solder and push it into the joint. So let's create that little heat bridge, heat up that joint, push in from the other side, and done. Too easy. Let's try again. Let's create a little heat bridge, push it in from the other side, and done. Now I'm going to give it a moment to cool. And once the joint is cool, we can go ahead and clip these leads off. And I'm going to hold the leads while I clip them so they don't go flying and poke me in the eye. Or create a hazard to my feet next time I walk through my office. All right, so that's D1. Now let's check our manual, and it says step 2, we're going to do resistors, R1 and R2. So let's go back to our component sheet, pull out R1 and R2. So let's do them one at a time. We don't want to get them mixed up. So let's do R1 first. So I'm going to push R1 out. Now a quick little tip. If you accidentally get these mixed up, go back to your booklet, page 5 with the pre-sorted components, and we'll look at it here, and you'll see it tells you the color codes of the resistor. So I can see that R1, for example, has bands on it that are green, brown, black, orange, brown. So I'll go back and look through my resistors and find the one with the colors that match that. And that's going to be 510 kilo ohms, and that tells you how much resistance it provides. So that's our R1. But hopefully you won't need that, and that's the whole reason we do these pre-sorted component trays, is so you don't have to read those color codes, because that's never really fun to do. All right, so R1, and I don't know if you can see on the camera, but the color codes do match what we just said, so I'm going to bend the leads, stick it in this spot here for R1. Now, unlike the diodes, the resistors don't have polarity. It doesn't matter which way you put these in. I can flip this 180 degrees and it will still work. So I'm going to pull the leads through. I'm going to bend them out like this to hold it in place. And make sure it's nice and flush on the surface. Now, just like with the practice kit, if these are not flush, it'll work just fine. It doesn't matter. It's really just an aesthetic preference. I like them to look neat and tidy, so I try to pull them flush. Now I'm going to attach that to the table there. Check my tip, maybe tin it again just to be safe. And let's come in here and solder these joints now. So let's get a little heat bridge, heat it up, push in some solder from the other side, and the solder wasn't flowing. I went to go push this solder in, and I just felt resistance. So that I clearly wasn't heating up the joint very well. So let me double check my tip, make sure it's looking good. Now come in and reassess the placement of my tip. Push really good against the component in the pad, and there we go, that's much better. Now let's go ahead and do this joint. Heat it up, push some solder in, and done. Let's let that cool for a moment, and then we can snip the leads off these resistors. All right, so that's R1. Now let's do R2. Go back to my component card. I'm going to push my resistor out here. Set that aside. Now I'll take my resistor, bend the leads again. So it's more of a U shape, and let's press it into place for R2. And again, the resistor's direction doesn't matter, so I can take this out and rotate it 180 degrees. It'll still be fine. Now I'm going to pull the leads out with my needle nose pliers. And as you can see here, I also bent them out a little bit to hold it in place. Let's check and make sure it looks flush. And let's solder this one. Give myself a heat bridge, come in here from the other side. Let's heat up the other joint. Put a little solder in there to get a heat bridge. Press some solder into the joint. And let's snip the leads. And let's go back and check our book again. So next we're going to do our transistor, Q1. And you'll notice, or you may notice, we're kind of going from shortest component to highest component. And that allows us to place the lower components in there and not have them fall out when we turn it upside down. If you put your taller components first and then try to put your shorter ones in, it just won't sit as nicely on the table. But it's not a big deal. The specific order of these doesn't matter much. Okay, so I've got my transistor here. You see it's rounded on one side and flat on the other. And if you look at our circuit board, the outline on here is the same. It's flat on one side, rounded on the other. So we're going to place this into the holes so its body matches that outline. Now my legs don't quite line up, so I'm just going to take my fingers and pull them apart a little bit. I'm just going to space them out a little bit. And let's try again. Okay, so I push that in there. I'm just going to give it a good little shove. And it's sitting there nice and snug, and I think that's good enough. Now some people, what they like to do is they like to strategically bend the legs of the transistor so they come out at an angle and then down. And so if you take your needle nose pliers, you can bend one leg out, bend the other leg out, and then go down a bit and then bend it so it's straight. And you'll have like this nice fork shape. That's optional. I think it doesn't really matter. I think just pushing this in like this is fine. And then to hold it in place, I'm going to grab these two outer legs and pull them a little bit. And now, let's set this on the table, use a little blue putty to hold it in place, and let's solder each of these legs. All right, the first one, and you can see it. Let's see, second one, that's good. Third one. And that's it, too easy. And let me check my joints, make sure they look good, and they do. So I'm going to come in here with my flush cutters. I'm going to actually hold all three of these while I clip them at the same time. Now you don't have to get all fancy like this, but it'll save you a bit of time. And now you can see that transistor is sitting there, and its outline matches the outline on the board. Next, we're going to do our capacitors, C1 and C2. So let's grab C1 first. So C1 is the big one, C2 is the smaller one. Yours might be the same size. It just depends which vendor we're using at any given time. But the value on this one is bigger, which is why it's physically bigger many times. So let's put our C1 in the spot. And these capacitors are not polarized. That means I can insert it in either direction. So I can pull this out and flip it around or flip it this way. Either way is fine. Some capacitors, not for this pedal kit, but some capacitors in some kits are polarized. Okay, I've got C1 inserted here. I'm going to bend its legs out to hold it in place so it doesn't fall off the board. Secure it in place with my putty here. And I'm going to tin my tip. It's been a while here. It's getting kind of oxidized. Let's put some fresh solder on there. And let's come in and solder these two joints. So make a nice little heat bridge and push some solder into the joint. Make a nice heat bridge. That one's not taken very well, so I'm going to give it a moment to cool and try again. All right, let me push my iron into that joint, add some solder, and that one worked a lot better. So I think what happened is I just didn't have my soldering tip pressed up against that joint very well. And that happens sometimes, but the key is that when you go to push that solder in, if you feel the resistance, back up, reassess, try again. Okay, C1 is good to go. Let's go back to our component card, and let's pull C2 out of here. So let's put C2 into its home, turn it over, push those legs out. Now let's heat up the joint, push some solder in, heat up the joint, push some solder in, give it a moment to cool, and then let's clip those off. Now, a quick note, you'll notice I'm not using a fan right now, so these fumes from the flux are coming up into my face. I don't recommend doing that. I recommend having a fan to blow that out of your face, or to use a fan with a carbon filter to suck it in and into the carbon filter. And ordinarily I do that, but it's too noisy for the video. That's why we're doing it this way. Now, if you're building the optional pickup simulator kit, pause right here and head over to the instructions or the video for that kit. Right now your main PCB looks like the one on the left here. Then when you're done building your pickup simulator, it'll look like the one on the right. And then come back here and carry on with our next step. Okay, so now we've got 2 resistors, 2 capacitors, 1 transistor, and 1 diode. So let's go back to our book. And next we want to attach the ribbon cables. So there are 2 ribbon cables. There's a larger, longer one and a shorter, smaller one. So this is the larger one's obviously gonna go there. The 4 conductor one's obviously gonna go there. And when I want to insert this ribbon into the board, insert it into the side with the square on it. If I flip this over, I can still see these holes, but there's no square drawn around them. So I'm going to pull this insulation off the tip. I'm going to leave the insulation on the other side because that's keeping these wires nice and straight. Once I pull that off, it's really easy to bend those out of shape. And once you bend them out of shape, it's hard to line them up into the holes. So pull those off. I'm going to insert them into these holes here on the side with the square. Give it a little wiggle, get it in there. Now I'm going to flip it over and solder those 6 joints right there. Now, the best way to hold this, I don't know, it's going to depend. I think I'm going to try taking my putty. I'm going to pull it to 2 pieces. There we go. I'm going to stick 1 piece of putty there to hold that ribbon. And then I'll go ahead and stick another piece down here to hold the circuit board. That'll make everything nice and secure. All right, so you might notice your cable might have a red side. It might not, but if it does, we're not using that red wire to indicate anything in particular. So it doesn't matter which side it's on. It can be here, it can be over there. So I'm going to go ahead and tin my tip again. And then come in here and we're going to solder these 6 wires. So I'm going to start on this edge. It doesn't matter where you start, but let's go ahead and heat that up. Get some good heat applied and push some solder in. I'm going to come over to the other side here. For no particular reason, but just because. All right. Now let's do the next one. And just keep going, one at a time. Just like we did all of our other solder joints. These wires are no different. Now that particular joint didn't feel great, so I'm going to go back and reflow it. Push a little more solder in just to be safe. And let's go on into our last one. And, oh, this is awesome. So we've got an opportunity to fix a problem. So I just pushed too much solder into that joint. And let's see if we can show you here. As you can see, I've got a solder bridge on these last 2 wires. So that blob of solder connected those 2. And we do not want that. So there's a lot of ways to fix that, but here's the easiest way to do it. When you get those, just go ahead and wipe your tip off really, really well. And then let's try it without tinning it. So take a nice hot iron without much solder on it and just stick it in there. And look at that. I'm going to go ahead and clean my tip first and then we'll talk about it. So I'm just wanting to get some solder on my tip before it starts to oxidize because it wasn't protected there. So you'll see that solder's gone. I just used my soldering iron to pull off the excess. And this last joint here looks kind of bulbous, so just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and reflow it, make sure it still looks okay. There we go. Now we've got 6 little nice concave mountain shapes. That's perfect. So if you ever get a solder blob between two pads that you don't want, cleaning your tip and sticking the clean tip in there and just letting that solder wick up onto the tip is usually the best way to do it. If that doesn't work, you can use specialized tools like a solder wick or a solder pump, but that's not usually necessary. Okay, 1 ribbon down, let's go ahead and get the other one done. So I'm going to take the smaller ribbon, pull the insulation off one side. I'm going to stick it in where the side with the squares. So now you've got your ribbons and your components all coming up off the same side of the board. So I'm going to flip this over, see if we can hold it in place with some blue putty. And let's do those 4 solder joints. So let's heat it up. Put some solder in there, heat it up. Put some solder in there. And just keep doing it. And if any of your joints aren't working well, just stop, reassess, let it cool. and try again. The important thing is not to sit there like, if you're ever having a problem with the solder joint, the worst thing you can do is just sit there and just keep jamming your iron in there and holding it there for 5-10 seconds and just going at it like a maniac, because that's going to overheat the board. That's going to make the pads lift off. You're going to end up with damage. It's not going to be fun. It's not going to be pretty. So best thing you can do is back up, let yourself breathe for a minute, let the joint cool down, come back and try again. All right. Whoops, you'll see I accidentally pulled the insulation off that with my blue putty, but that's okay. We'll just be careful not to bend those. But here we go. Our main circuit board with a ribbon on the bottom and a ribbon on the top, and I think we're good to go. So, checking our book, the next thing we want to do is start our foot switch circuit board. So the foot switch circuit board is this one with the grid of 9 holes on it, the larger holes. And this is where our foot switch is going to be, as well as the LED and the resistor that's going to limit the current going to that LED. We're going to hold off installing the LED for now. If we really wanted to, we could, but we want this LED to sit at the correct height because the circuit board won't be flush with the enclosure. So coming over here, for example, you might have the circuit board right here and you've got the LED up there, so there's a certain space between them. So to get that space pretty close, we're going to use these LED spacers, and this helps hold the LED up while we solder it. It won't get it exact though. So what we're going to do is, if you really wanted to, you could go ahead and install this LED and solder it now. It'll be good enough. But if we want this LED to sit perfectly flush coming out of the enclosure, at just the right height that we're looking for, we will install the LED when we're ready, when everything's in the enclosure. So anyway, for now, let's go ahead and just solder R3. So let's go over to our component kit, pull out R3. And just like we've done in the past, we're going to bend the resistor, nice little U shape, and let's install it into R3. And bend them out a little bit so it holds it in place. Then look at the front, it's sitting nice and flush there. Let's use our blue putty to hold it in place. Okay, now tin the tip. And let's solder these 2 joints. Now we want to solder this foot switch circuit board to this ribbon cable here. And so just like before, the ribbon is going to go into the side that has the rectangle drawn around it. And so you'll see when we hold it like this, you've got the ribbon coming up to the foot switch circuit board, and the foot switch circuit board has the swirly side going up. So let's go ahead and hold this into place with some blue putty, and let's solder those 6 wires now. And to help keep it from getting a little bit crooked, I'll usually solder one side and then go ahead and grab the other side. That way the other side can't pull out. Do those solder joints look okay? Yep, we've got 6 nice little concave mountains, and this one is good to go. Okay, next we're going to set this aside and we're going to start the jack circuit board. So the jack circuit board is the one that has the in and the out on it. So let's start by soldering D2, so diode 2. And that should be our last component in our component card down here, the big black and gray diode. And so let's bend the leads. And just like with our other diode, this one has a stripe as well. And you can see on the circuit board we have a stripe here at the bottom, and that corresponds to this gray stripe on our diode. So that'll tell us which direction it goes in. So I'm going to go ahead and insert that with the gray stripe over the stripe on the circuit board. Let me double, triple, quadruple check that the stripes are lined up, because that's very important. If this diode gets in backwards, you're going to have a bad time. I'm going to bend the leads out to hold that diode in place, and let's go ahead and solder it. And let's double check, excuse me, let's double check our book, make sure we're still on track. Yep, now we want to install the DC jack. So this is the DC jack. This is where you plug your power into, and that's going to go into this DC power spot. So these 3 lugs line up with the 3 spots on the circuit board. Now, if your jack wants to fall out, here, let me fix my exposure here. Now, if your jack wants to fall out, one option is you can bend the little legs to hold them in place. The other option is we can use a little bit of blue putty here to make sure that doesn't want to fall out. So let's flip it over and solder this one into place. Okay, so you'll see these solder pads are longer and the lugs are a bit bigger than what we've been soldering so far. So as a result, I'm going to probably move my tip back and forth on that joint while I heat it up to heat up the whole thing faster. If I just hold it in one place, it'll eventually get heated up, but this is a good way to spread that heat a little more quickly. So I'm going to sort of run it back and forth and watch that solder start to flow on there. Let's do that again. Put a little bit of a heat bridge back and forth, and that looks good. And one last time. This one will hold it in place and see how that goes. Yeah, it's working. I saw one side was a little hesitant to take the solder, but I guess I didn't really have to flow my iron back and forth. So let's check those joints. I think those look pretty good. So now let's go ahead and set this circuit board aside. And if you're curious, the reason we're not going to yet install these in and out jacks, let me zoom out here. The reason we're not going to install these in and out jacks yet is because we're going to mount them to the panel. And so when we mount them into this panel on the enclosure, we're going to tighten them down. And what will happen if we solder these in advance and there's any little bit of imperfection in how well they're lined up, when we tighten them down, that's going to want to pull them into the correct alignment. And that's going to put pressure on the solder joints and possibly crack them, or at least it could hurt their integrity a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to tighten these down onto the enclosure first, then push this circuit board onto the jacks and solder them in place. And that's a common theme. We're going to do that with any panel mounted parts. Typically you don't want to solder something onto a board and then panel mount it in a way that might put any sort of stress onto those solder joints. All right, so next we want to prepare our potentiometers and install them in the enclosure. So to prepare them, we're going to look at them and make sure we have a nice 90-degree angle on the legs. So this one looks good. Let's check this one. This one looks good too. Although let's say, for example, you pull it out of the bag and it looks like that. So no problem. Let's just bend it back into place. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just get it as close to 90 as you can. And then let's also check to make sure the legs are perpendicular and you don't have one that's, askew like that. So make sure they're all nice and lined up and evenly spaced. That looks good. This one looks good. Okay, now we're going to want to remove these anti-rotation tabs. So what these are for is sometimes when you go to install a potentiometer into an enclosure, you can have an extra hole on the side here or a slot that this little tab sits into. And what that allows you to do is when you turn this and reach the end, if you push really hard, it's going to want to rotate, and that anti-rotation tab will help prevent that. But realistically, you've got to put a lot of pressure onto it to make it rotate as long as you tighten these down nice and snug. So as a result, because it's not strictly necessary, most guitar pedal builders don't actually use those rotation tabs. So what we're going to do instead for simplicity is we're going to snap them off. So what you want to do is grab that tab and twist it outward. So we're going to take the tab and twist it that way. Now, if you don't have, you can do that with needle nose pliers. If you don't have needle nose pliers, we can use our flush cutters. Just like we did with snapping the circuit boards, we're not going to cut it off with these. We're just going to grip it with this and snap it to the side. So I'm going to grab it and then pull sideways, and there it goes. And then let's do our other one here. I'm going to grab that, pull it sideways, and that's it. Okay, so your potentiometer may already have this plastic back on it, and if it does, you're good to go. This is a dust cover to help keep dust from getting up inside there. Now, if it doesn't, look in your plastic bag for one of these caps, and it'll simply go on the back of it. But if you look closely, you'll notice there's a bit of a cutout right here. And so that L-shaped cutout like that will accommodate these legs right here. So what we're going to do is just line that up and then press them together. May take a bit of force. And there you go. Check and make sure you've got it as tight as possible here, as tight as possible there. Press it down a little more if you need to, and you're all set. Now we want to install them in our enclosure. So when we look, we see one of these says B100K. Yours might say A100K, but the point is there's a 100K on there. And one is 10K. So this one gives you 10,000 ohms of resistance. This one gives you 100,000 ohms of resistance. So what you want to do is go look in your booklet. You will see we show that the 10K is our gain potentiometer and the 100K is our volume potentiometer. And we're looking at it from the perspective of the inside of the enclosure. So we've got our gain on the left and our volume on the right. Let's verify. So this is our gain. Flip it over. Yep, there my finger is in the gain. And you got your volume on the right. When you're looking inside the enclosure, you flip it over, your volume on your left. So let's go ahead and install those two. So let's take our 100K, and that's our volume. I'm going to push that in through the hole, and I'm holding it in there with my finger. Now I'm going to take 2 nuts and 2 washers. And you'll find that you've got a handful of these, and these are going to be the smallest ones you have right now. So I'm going to take 1 washer, slide it on the outside of the enclosure, and then put a nut over it. And then just tighten that down with my finger for now. Now I'm going to take my 10K potentiometer, install it into the hole for the gain, hold it in place with my finger, flip it over, add a washer, add a nut, and let's tighten that down. Now once these are finger tight, I want to get them really snug. So what I want to do first is straighten out these bodies so they're perpendicular with the edge here. And these lugs are perpendicular with the other edge. So hold those in place. I'm going to push kind of hard with my finger to make sure it doesn't want to rotate. Then I'm going to take my red tool here, and using the one that says pots for potentiometers, I'm just going to put that on there and get it nice and snug. Now I felt this rotate while I did that, so I'm going to rotate it back with my fingers, and let's try to hold it in place while we tighten it down. All right, now let's do the other one. Just get it nice and snug. Let's double check, make sure we're still aligned. And that looks pretty good. So now with the 2 potentiometers installed, we're going to flip it back over, and now we're going to install our main circuit board. Actually, before we install this main circuit board, let's go ahead and talk about cleaning. So this is covered in great detail in it's covered in sufficient detail in our How to Solder booklet. So if you haven't already, take a look at the How to Solder booklet. But basically, depending on what type of flux you're using, what type of flux is in your solder wire, you may or may not need to clean this. So if you see nasty brown spots all over it, you definitely want to clean it. If you don't, and you have what's called a no clean flux, well then it's optional. You decide whether or not you want to do it. So what we're going to do is take this opportunity before we install it to clean these few solder joints. And the way we do that is just with some rubbing alcohol. So this is, I want to say 91 or 99% rubbing alcohol. The higher the percentage, the better. Sometimes 99 is hard to get, at least it is near me, whereas the 91% stuff is carried by most drugstores. So that's what I'm using here. So I'm just going to liberally flood this area with a bunch of rubbing alcohol. And then I can use an old toothbrush, or I guess whatever abrasive thing you can find, if you have a sponge or even a paper towel, just something to clean it off. So I'm going to take this brush and just scrub away that flux. And then you can visually inspect it and see if you still see some on there. And if you do, just flood it again and scrub it away. Okay, I grabbed a paper towel here. I'm going to use this to mop up the excess. Clean off my workstation here, and it's pretty good. The longer the rubbing alcohol takes to dry, the more you'll see a little bit of a haze on there or a sticky residue. You can clean it a few more times and try to dry it quickly, and that'll take care of that. Now the quickest way to dry it, and this is what I do when I'm soldering a whole bunch of stuff at once, is I'll flood it with the alcohol, scrub it, clean it off, and then I'll take a hose from an air compressor and blow that, and that'll leave you a nice clean finish. But really, it's just aesthetic. It doesn't matter. Okay. All right, now that this is clean, let's go ahead and install it inside of our enclosure here. So I'm going to bend this ribbon out of the way, and then all we're going to do is just place these 6 solder pads for the potentiometers on top of the lugs for the potentiometers. And if you find that they don't want to line up nicely, just go back and rotate these. You might have to loosen the nuts on the other side, rotate them, or bend their legs to where they need to be. And now once we have this installed, let's just get it nice and straight, get it pushed on there really well, and then let's solder these 6 joints. Okay, so the legs of these potentiometers are probably the biggest hunks of metals that we've soldered so far. And so as a result, they're going to require a little more heat, which means you might find that you have to hold the iron on there for a little bit longer than you've been doing so far. So I'm going to get a good heat bridge here, press down pretty firmly, and press some solder into the joint. But otherwise, we're going to do these exactly like we did every other solder joint so far. So I felt a bit of resistance there, so I spread out the heat a little bit, gave it a little bit longer to heat up, and that took care of it. And like we did with the DC jacks, you might move your iron around a little bit to spread out the heat if necessary. Okay, so let's check our booklet, see what's next. All right, now with that in place, let's go ahead and get our jack board installed. So now we're going to put these jacks into these spots here and just give it a little bit of a wiggle if it doesn't want to fit right away. But we're going to loosely install these first. We're not going to solder them down until we get them mounted. And if your legs are a little bit bent out of shape, you might need to bend them, but probably not. So I'm going to wiggle them, and seat them. Make sure they're nice and flush. Okay, now with these jacks sitting flush on this board, we're going to install this into the enclosure. We're going to solder the ribbon cable onto this side here with the rectangle around it. So I pulled the insulation off of the ribbon cable. Now I'm just going to set this over those 4. So now I see the 4 wires coming up through these 4 pads right here. And just like with the foot switch jack, we want the swirly side facing up. So with this just seated in there and gravity holding it down, I'm going to solder those 4 wires. I wasn't sure about that joint, so I reflowed it just to be safe. And let's take a closer look, and I think those all look really good. So next we're going to seat these jacks into the panel here. Now you'll notice I still haven't soldered these into place. We're waiting to do that. And a quick note, depending upon which supplier your enclosure came from, you may have some burrs along the edge here. They don't really affect anything and you can just safely leave them, but if they really bother you, you can just file them out with a small file. Unfortunately, that's just a side effect of having to use one of the suppliers we do, because most of the people I work with for enclosures, they want a minimum order quantity for graphic designs, and because we're offering you so many different designs to pick from, we have to sort of compromise and find a place that's willing to do one-off enclosure designs. All right, so let's seat these into place here. Push them through, and now you can see we've got our jack coming through and these 2 jacks coming through. Now we're going to take 2 more washers and 2 more nuts and slide those over and hand tighten them down. All right, another washer, another nut, hand tighten it down. And now I'm going to use my tool again. This time I'm going to use the one that says in out. I'm going to use that to tighten these down really well. Just get them nice and snug so they don't work themselves loose. All right, there we go. Next, I am going to check this circuit board here and make sure that it's pushed all the way down on top of the jacks and that the jacks lugs are sticking up and sticking through. Also, while we're at it, I see I left a little bit of blue putty on that solder joint there. It's actually not going to harm anything, but to get it off, we're just going to use the putty and just push it up against there like that and pull it off. Okay, so let's go ahead and solder these 6 joints to hold the jacks on. Let me zoom in a bit. All right, here we go. Let's do these 4. Now these are long and skinny, just like the DC jacks were, so you might move the soldering iron back and forth a little bit. It's not necessary, it's just something I like to do. All right, those look good. Now let's go back and do the other side. So you'll see these are taking a little bit more heat. I'm taking longer to solder these joints than I have the previous ones, and that's okay. These are not terribly heat sensitive. You know, if you're soldering it for about 3, 4, 5 seconds, that's pretty normal. That's pretty good. All right, there we go. Next, we're going to mount our foot switch. Okay, your foot switch has quite a bit of hardware here. You'll have one nut here, and this is optional. What this will allow you to do is adjust how high this part sits up out of your enclosure. I like to leave one down here at the bottom. You can make it a little higher if you want to make this shorter, or you can take it off altogether if you want to make it taller. But I'm just going to leave one. I think that's good. Next, we're going to put a lock washer on there. So that's this washer with the teeth on it. With both of those in place, we're going to grab this board, get it out of the way, and let's install this into the enclosure. Now flip it over. So I'm holding the foot switch in place with my fingers over here. And next I'm going to put my washer on. So this is just the plastic washer that comes with it. But this is an example of an area where you can customize your pedal if you'd like with some aftermarket stuff. So for example, there are some anodized aluminum washers that can go here. There are these large anodized aluminum nuts that can go on there. There are just regular silver aluminum washers that look kind of slick. Those are my favorites. But for now, we'll just use this white one. And I'm going to hand tighten that. Let's flip it back over and look at something here. Now you'll see these solder lugs are long and skinny, and you want those to be running parallel with this base of the enclosure right here. You don't want them running up and down like this. That will not work. And you'll learn that pretty quickly when you go to try to install this circuit board and it doesn't want to fit on there. So we're running that way. Now I'm going to go ahead and tighten this down, and I'm going to use my tool here that says foot switch. I'll do this off camera here. So tightening that down and then double checking, flipping it over to make sure this is still perpendicular, and it got a little bit out of whack, so I'm going to twist it a bit and then continue tightening it. All right, so now with our foot switch in place, we're ready to go on to our next step, which is we're going to install the LED and the LED spacer. Okay, so to install the LED and the LED spacer, what you're going to do is just find your LED, find the spacer. And the spacer is optional, but I like it because it makes it easier to solder it into place. And you'll see the spacer has these grooves. Can you see that? So the legs of the LED just sit into those 2 grooves on the outside. So you have one leg here, one leg there, and that's it. So the legs of the LED, you have a longer one, which is your anode, or the positive side. You have a shorter one, which is your cathode, or the negative side. And if for whatever reason you were reusing an LED and these were clipped off, you could tell which side it goes, which side is which by looking at the base of the LED. You've got a flat side on the cathode side, the negative side. So if we look at the circuit board for the foot switch, look at the LED spot, and you'll see you've got a plus here on the outside, and you've got a flat line on the inside. So your cathode's going to go on the inside, and your anode, the longer leg, is going to go on the outside. So knowing that, I'm going to take my LED, I'm going to grab my longer side and make sure that one, and I'm going to go ahead and just drop that into the hole. with my longer leg being closer to the wall of the enclosure. Now I'm going to take the circuit board, go down and slide those, here we go, slide the two legs of the LED into these two holes here for the LED. And this part could be a little tricky. Another option is I can pull this through. Maybe what I'll do is I'll pull that through, bend it a little bit to hold it in place, and then drop it down into the hole. You can just experiment, try a couple ways, see what works best for you. All right, so while I put that LED through the hole, then I'm going to push the board over the lugs for the foot switch. Now I'm going to hold that with my finger so it doesn't fall out, go to the other side, and we can see that the LED's poking through. So that's good. Now I'm going to disregard the LED for a moment, and my priority is going to be to get this foot switch circuit board to just be flush and soldered to that foot switch. So I'm going to use a little bit of putty here to kind of hold this into place. Just push a little putty right there. And make sure all the lugs are sticking up. That looks good. So what I'm going to do now is go in and I'm going to solder one foot switch lug. So now the foot switch lugs, unfortunately, this is one of the trickiest parts of soldering. So on one hand, these foot switch lugs are big and thick and they require a lot of heat just to have that solder start to flow. On the flip side, inside the base of that foot switch is some epoxy. And if you overheat it, that epoxy will start to melt and then the inside will destabilize and potentially break the foot switch. So with these, you have to get enough heat to flow, but like not too much that you're gonna break it. And it's a little bit tricky to find that balance. So what I recommend, go about 5 seconds at a time. And then if you're still not done, that's okay. Back up, let it cool down, go in there again and try again. So let's go ahead and do our first foot switch lug. I'm just gonna pick the middle one arbitrarily. Let me tin my tip really well. Get it nice and clean. Make sure we have plenty of solder on there to transfer the heat. All right, so let's go in there and solder this first one. And I'm just gonna kind of count about 5 seconds, then I'm gonna stop when we get to 5. And for this one, I'm definitely gonna move my iron around a little bit to try to heat up the whole area of the pad, because that's a very large oval pad. So let's go in there, we got 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000. Actually, that's probably good. I'm gonna stop right there. So you'll see I've got a nice little mountain dome of solder around that foot switch lug. So now we can remove our putty, because we don't need this to hold the circuit board in place anymore, because this solder joint is going to hold it in place. All right, so with that holding it in place, we can go ahead and solder the other 8 joints here. So let's just do that. Now I'm going to go ahead and do one row here. Let me do this one. And stop. Now I'm going to skip this middle one, and the reason is it's pretty close to this one right here, and there might be still some residual heat inside the foot switch from that one. So I'm going to go ahead and skip that one. I'm going to do my next one. And there's not a science to this. The idea is I'm just trying to minimize the amount of heat inside that foot switch that could potentially damage it. I think now would be a good time to take a break. Let's take a break, give this about 10-15 seconds to cool down, and then move on to maybe the bottom row here or the middle row. It's not strictly necessary. I often do these foot switches all in one go, but doing that's kind of risky. It really depends. It depends on your level of comfort and how much time it's taking to do each of these joints. So let's heat this one up, get plenty of solder in there, and let's stop. I'm going to jump over to here because it's physically farther away from that one. Let's transfer some heat back and forth. Now push some more solder in. Whoops. There we go. Now you'll see I'm doing sort of an X pattern here, but again, it doesn't really matter. It just makes me feel better knowing that there's a little bit of space in there. Whether or not that's actually helping to mitigate the heat, I can't say for sure. I've never done any real experiments. But again, if in doubt, wait longer than I'm waiting here. I'm not as worried about a working pedal as you are, so I'm going a little bit faster. Plus, I'm sure you're eager to get this done, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But for you and your pedal, I say wait 5 or 10 seconds between these joints. So you'll see, I've done this a lot, but it's especially important here. You'll see I'm using some solder when I initially apply that heat to get a really good heat bridge. I'm moving it back and forth, adding more. That's good. So I'm heating it up. Now I'm going to go ahead and push some fresh solder in there. And I think those are pretty good. So now let's go ahead and solder this LED into place. So right now you'll see when I flip it over, it's sort of recessed. Personally, I like it when the LED is popping out a little bit like that. So I'm going to turn it over, make sure it's still popping out. And I reach my finger underneath there and I can feel that it's still sticking out. So we're good to go. And I'm going to go ahead and simply solder those two leads on the LED. All right, so let's give those a minute to cool and then we'll clip the leads. And these I couldn't grab while I was clipping it, but I can put my finger over it to kind of hold it onto the clippers here. Let's zoom out, let's take a closer look here, and let's just inspect everything. Now we'll see our main circuit board got tilted down a little bit when we soldered it. As long as none of the ribbon cable joints right here are touching the enclosure, we're fine. If we're in doubt or we just don't like it, we can bend those leads just a wee bit to pull it up. No big deal. And let's just visually inspect everything. We've got our swirls are facing up on both sides. We've got all of our ribbon cable joints soldered. We've got all of our parts soldered into the main board. Let's refocus this. We've got our LED soldered into place. We flip it over. We've got all of our hardware is mounted and tightened down. That's good. Our LEDs sticking out a little bit. Okay, everything looks good. So probably the last thing we want to do now is go ahead and just use some alcohol and scrub the joints on these two circuit boards. So do your foot switch, do your jacks, clean those off, and you're good to go. And that's optional. Again, it depends on what type of flux you're using. So let's go ahead and put our knobs on. All right, to put the knobs on, we're just going to go ahead and crank both the volume and the gain all the way to the top, so that way we know, reference where it should be. That should be approximately like that. And then these knobs just simply push onto the potentiometers. So these potentiometer shafts have these grooves in it, 18 little grooves, which match the 18 grooves inside the knob. And we chose these because this doesn't require any special or extra tools. That helps keep the cost of the kit down and helps ensure you don't need to go out and buy more tools. More commonly though, a lot of people will use smooth shafts, and then the knob will have a set screw in there that either requires a really tiny flathead screwdriver or it requires a hex Allen key. But these, they just push right on. So I'm going to go ahead and line it up to where I want it. So this is cranked all the way. I think this is probably a good spot. And then just push it on. Now, let me show you. Let's say you push that on. And this probably won't be the case for you, but let's say you push that on and it feels loose and it just wants to fall off. Well, here's what you're going to want to do. So you'll see the shaft of this potentiometer is split. So what you can do is take a flathead screwdriver, stick it into this shaft, stick it into the split on the shaft, and just ever so gently pry them apart a wee tiny bit, just a tiny bit. And then go ahead and fit your knob back on and see if that works. And if it doesn't, go in there, pry them apart just a wee tiny bit, and then try it again. You don't want to press them apart too far too quickly, because what's going to happen is that shaft will actually snap right off. So just a hair at a time. And then once it feels tight enough, let's go ahead and install our knob. Let's make sure these are both lined up. All right. Beautiful. All right, 2 finishing touches now. Let's flip it over and let's first, down here we got this little section that says built by. Go ahead and add your signature there. And we're going to want to install our back plate. So the back plate, just stick it on there. You've got 4 screws that came with it. Put your 4 screws in. If you don't have a screwdriver, you can use the pick that came with your kit, but it's just a Phillips head screwdriver. It should be pretty common and easy to find. All right, there we have it. And your pedal's done. Super exciting. So please, please, please go ahead and take a picture of it. Show us the insides of it. Take a gut shot. Show us the front. Come post it on the forum. We'd love, love, love to see what you guys built. And similarly, if you're having any problems, take some pictures, come on over to the forum and tell us what you're experiencing, and we'll help you get through it. We are very, very committed to ensuring you have a working pedal when you're done. So please, please, please let us know. I hope you had a lot of fun building this. We're going to have more kits coming soon. We've already got some other kits, so feel free to check out our site and see what else you can build next. There are plenty of other great options for building your next pedal, whether you want to buy a circuit board off the shelf, pedal PCB or Aeon Effects, or whether you want to build it from scratch, take some strip board or Vero board and just build it totally from scratch, or just grab another kit from another brand. But whatever you happen to build, we want to see it. So keep in touch, stay in our forums, let us see what you're building, let us know how it's going, and yeah, we're super excited to have you involved in this hobby. So have a great day.